Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to another journey through the quiet corridors of history. Tonight, we are traveling far into the medieval past, not to the castles of kings or the grand cathedrals that still rise above old towns, but into the simple, overlooked world of the peasant. For while nobles and knights may fill the pages of history books, it was the peasants, the men, women, and children of the fields and villages, who formed the very backbone of medieval life. But what did they really do all day? How did they live, work, eat, and dream in an age before electricity, before modern comforts, before even the idea of freedom as we know it today? This is not a story of great battles or famous names, but of the rhythm of daily existence, the scratch of the plow in the soil, the crackle of the hearth at night, the bells of the church calling the village together, and the hushed silence that fell when darkness swallowed the countryside. As you listen, allow the calm pace of this story to settle you down. Each detail of the medieval peasant's day will unfold slowly, like a candle flickering against the walls of a simple hut. Let your mind drift as we step into their shoes, following them from dawn to dusk, through fields and festivals, into the shadows of authority, and finally into the uncertain dark of night. So close your eyes, slow your breathing, and prepare to walk side by side with the forgotten millions who carried the weight of medieval society. This is the daily life of medieval peasants, told not in haste, but in a gentle, steady rhythm, perfect for guiding you into rest. In the world of medieval Europe, peasants began their day not with alarm clocks or bustling city sounds, but with the slow glow of the rising sun stretching across fields and villages. A peasant's cottage, often built of timber and daubed with mud, would be dimly lit, the only hint of morning seeping through cracks in the thatched roof or small shuttered windows. Families typically rose early, long before modern people would consider it reasonable, because daylight was the only reliable working time they had. Artificial lighting was rare and expensive, so sunrise marked the beginning of activity. The roosters crow, the sound of livestock stirring, and the distant toll of a church bell were the village's natural alarms. Sleep was never particularly comfortable. Beds were straw-stuffed mattresses shared by entire families, sometimes even with small animals kept indoors for warmth. The air was cold and damp in winter, heavy with smoke from the hearth if one had burned embers overnight. For peasants, waking was not a slow or leisurely affair. It was a necessity driven by survival. Each day required labor, and every hour of sunlight lost was an hour of productivity wasted. With little sense of privacy and limited possessions, mornings were communal, routine, and focused entirely on preparing for the demands of the land and the household. Children, too, were drawn into the rhythm of dawn. From an early age, even the youngest were expected to contribute to the day's labor, whether by tending chickens, fetching water, or helping to gather firewood. For many peasant families, the first activity after waking was to rekindle the hearth fire, which was vital for warmth and cooking. The previous evening's embers were carefully banked to last through the night, But if the fire died, striking a new flame was a chore requiring flint and patience. Once warmth was restored, the smell of simple breakfast preparations would fill the small space. Often little more than coarse bread, pottage made from leftover vegetables, or a watered-down ale. The peasant diet was repetitive and plain, but it gave just enough energy to sustain hours of physical toil. Women typically busied themselves with food preparation while men readied tools or checked on animals. In many villages, the rhythm of the day was marked by the church bell, summoning peasants to prayer before they began their duties in the fields. Religion was so intertwined with life that even the first breath of morning often included whispered prayers or gestures of devotion, thanking God for another day of survival. Waking in a peasant household was less about comfort and more about ritual, necessity, and the constant push forward into a day filled with challenges. The structure of the peasant home itself played a role in shaping the morning routine. Many cottages consisted of a single room, shared by the entire family, with animals housed at one end. This meant mornings were not private or quiet affairs, but instead a chorus of human voices, bleating goats, clucking hens, and children's cries all blending together. Bedding was simple: woven blankets, sheepskins, or even old cloaks spread across straw mats. And the discomfort ensured that people rarely lingered after waking. Space was so limited that possessions had to be carefully stored, tools hung along walls, and food kept in wooden chests or sacks suspended from beams to protect against rodents. As light crept in, the day's work began almost immediately. Unlike wealthier households, where servants could prepare the morning meal, peasants handled every detail themselves. Some men stepped outside to relieve themselves in the open fields or in basic latrine pits, while women fetched water from the village well. The well, often a social hub, would already be busy at dawn with neighbors exchanging greetings, complaints, or gossip as they filled buckets for cooking and washing. Life in these cottages was far from silent. Sound carried easily through thin walls, and the activities of one family echoed into the next. Waking was not a solitary act, but part of a shared village rhythm in which every household stirred to life together, each family a small cog in the greater machinery of survival. Once awake, peasants were immediately confronted with the practicalities of survival. Clothing was simple and often worn to bed for warmth, so getting dressed in the morning meant little more than tightening a belt, pulling on worn shoes if one owned them, and adjusting a woolen hood or cloak in cold months. Hygiene, as we understand it today, was minimal. Washing one's face with cold water from a wooden basin or at the village well was common, though full bathing was rare and often reserved for special occasions or holy days. Hair might be quickly braided, tied back, or covered with a cloth cap, while men's beards were often left untrimmed for weeks. The morning was not a time for grooming or luxury, but for immediate preparation for labor. Tools were gathered: hoes, sickles, plows, or baskets depending on the season's demands. Children too young to work in the fields were assigned household chores, such as sweeping, spinning wool, or helping care for younger siblings. Before leaving, many families paused for a short prayer before a crude wooden cross or religious token, asking for safety and strength. Faith guided every step of their lives, and beginning the day with prayer was as natural as eating. For peasants, each morning was both an act of endurance and a moment of hope, a chance to continue the cycle of toil that bound them to the land, yet also tied them to one another in shared struggle. Mornings also varied depending on the season, and this played a major role in shaping the peasant experience. In summer, daylight was abundant, and work began very early, often before the sun had fully risen. In winter, however, mornings were dark, cold, and sluggish, and peasants were forced to find ways to make use of shorter days. Seasonal rhythms dictated everything. Spring meant plowing and sowing, summer brought harvesting, autumn was for storing food and preparing for the harsh months, and winter was a time of repairing tools, tending animals, and enduring hunger. A summer morning might begin with teams of men and women heading into the fields, scythes slung over shoulders, while children followed behind carrying baskets. Winter mornings, in contrast, were quieter, with people huddled around the hearth, patching clothing or mending tools by firelight. But in every season, the act of waking was less about personal preference and more about obligation. Unlike modern life, where time is managed by schedules and clocks, peasants lived according to the rhythms of nature. Sunrise and sunset determined everything. The simplicity of this system meant that every morning felt predictable, repetitive, and firmly rooted in the unchanging cycle of survival. The first interactions of the day also reveal much about peasant life. As villagers emerged from their cottages, they often crossed paths on narrow dirt lanes or at communal gathering spots. Greetings were brief, shaped more by necessity than politeness, as everyone was preoccupied with the tasks ahead. The village bell, often rung by the church or by local officials, set the pace of the community. Its sound called people not only to prayer but also to labor, reminding them of their duties to the land and their obligations to the Lord who owned it. Some peasants began their mornings working on their own small plots, while others were bound by feudal obligation to start with the Lord's fields. Mornings therefore carried a sense of both personal responsibility and enforced duty, a balance that defined medieval life. The weight of taxes, rents, and tithes hung heavy even in these early hours, since much of the day's labor would ultimately benefit not the peasants themselves, but the ruling classes. Yet, despite this, mornings also offered small moments of humanity. Neighbors sharing a word of encouragement, mothers coaxing children to eat a crust of bread, or farmers checking the skies for signs of weather that might bless or curse the day ahead. Peasant mornings also highlight the theme of endurance. The lack of comfort, privacy, and luxury meant that life was lived in constant motion. Even the act of waking was tied to survival. There was no room for idleness or delay. For women, mornings might mean not only preparing food, but also beginning the day spinning, weaving, or sewing. tasks that filled every spare moment when they were not working in the fields. For men, mornings meant heavy labor, often beginning with the physical strain of preparing animals for work or carrying tools across uneven terrain. Children grew up quickly in this world, learning to shoulder responsibility at an age when modern children are still at play. Yet within these routines was also a sense of stability. Though hard, mornings followed predictable patterns, offering structure in a world that was otherwise uncertain and vulnerable to the whims of weather, disease, and lordly power. For many peasants, waking with the sun was not a choice, but it was also a rhythm that connected them to their ancestors and to the natural world around them. As the village settled into the rhythm of daybreak, the final moments of morning often blended seamlessly into the tasks of the day. The smell of smoke drifted from cottage chimneys, the sound of animals echoed through lanes, and the fields began to fill with figures bent over their work. The start of the day was both ordinary and monumental, marking yet another step in the endless cycle of medieval existence. To the modern mind, the simplicity of these mornings might seem monotonous, but for peasants, they carried meaning rooted in survival, faith, and community. Every dawn was a reminder of the fragility of life, yet also a sign of resilience. For each waking meant they had endured another night and would face another day. The predictability of mornings, their steady patterns and unchanging rituals, provided comfort in a world otherwise filled with uncertainty. Thus, the act of waking with the sunrise was more than a practical necessity. It was a rhythm of existence that shaped every moment of peasant life. To understand the life of medieval peasants, one must picture the fields that stretched beyond the clustered cottages of the village. These fields were not the wide, industrial farmlands of the modern era, but instead narrow strips of earth, divided and assigned according to custom and necessity. Each family might hold a scattering of strips across the village's open fields, ensuring that no single peasant was blessed with the best land nor cursed with the worst. It was a system designed for balance, but it also meant constant travel back and forth across uneven plots. Farming was not a romantic pursuit in these times, but a daily battle with soil that was often stony, heavy, or waterlogged. The fertility of the land varied greatly, and peasants relied heavily on the whims of weather and the mercy of the seasons. Their survival was bound to these strips of earth, for the grain and vegetables grown here formed the very basis of their diets. One poor harvest could mean hunger, two in a row could mean famine. The relationship between peasant and soil was one of dependency, weariness, and unending toil, yet it structured the rhythm of medieval existence. The primary crop of most medieval peasants was grain, and wheat, rye, oats, or barley filled the fields depending on the region. Bread was the cornerstone of medieval diets, so much so that shortages of bread could topple villages into despair. But farming grain required enormous effort. Fields had to be plowed, often with heavy wooden plows that cut poorly through the dense earth. These plows were usually drawn by oxen, animals strong but slow, and expensive to keep. A peasant rarely owned such beasts himself. Instead, animals might be shared within the community or hired from wealthier neighbors. Sowing seed was done by hand, scattering handfuls across the earth, a method both imprecise and wasteful by modern standards. Afterward, peasants relied entirely on rainfall, for irrigation systems were rare outside of more advanced medieval civilizations. Drought could shrivel crops before harvest, while too much rain could rot them in the soil. The uncertainty of farming weighed constantly upon peasant households, and the yield of each year's crop meant the difference between full bellies or gnawing hunger through winter. The field, then, was no passive landscape. It was an adversary, sometimes generous, but more often unforgiving. The medieval agricultural calendar revolved around the three-field system, which gradually spread across Europe during the Middle Ages. This system divided farmland into three sections: one for autumn crops such as rye or wheat, another for spring crops like oats or legumes, and the third left fallow to rest. Each year, the use of these fields rotated, ensuring that the soil could regain nutrients. To a modern farmer, this may seem inefficient, but it was revolutionary at the time. The introduction of legumes, which restored nitrogen to the soil, helped to keep land productive over the long term. Yet, even with this improvement, the work remained grueling. Peasants rose before dawn and often labored until dusk, pacing themselves to the rhythm of the seasons. Sowing, weeding, harvesting, threshing. Each task demanded hands, and entire families, including children, were expected to contribute. The physical demands were endless: bending, carrying, reaping, and grinding. There was no respite, only brief pauses marked by religious festivals, which often became the only moments of rest within a year of toil. The struggle with the land was not only physical but mental, for it reminded peasants daily that they were never more than one bad season away from catastrophe. Harvest season was the climax of the farming year, a moment of urgency and tension. The success of these weeks determined whether the community would eat or starve in the months to come. Harvest began with the ripening of grain, cut not with machines, but with sickles and scythes wielded by hand. The work was slow, repetitive, and exhausting. Fields had to be cleared quickly before rain spoiled the crop, yet there were never enough hands. Entire families took to the fields, and neighboring peasants often helped one another to finish the work in time. Once the grain was cut, it was bundled into sheaves and stacked in stooks to dry before being carted back to the village. The threshing of grain, separating the valuable kernels from stalk and husk, was another immense task, carried out with flails. The air in barns filled with dust and chaff, and the work seemed endless. Peasants knew that every kernel mattered. Spilled grain was not mere waste, but the loss of precious food. The harvest bound the entire village together in shared effort, yet it also magnified the inequalities between peasants. Wealthier villagers with more land reaped greater harvests, while the poorest often saw their supplies run out long before winter ended. Farming was also shaped by obligations beyond the family. The medieval peasant was rarely a freeholder in full control of his land. Most tilled soil that belonged to a lord or monastery. This meant that a portion of every harvest was owed as rent or tithe, reducing what remained for the peasant household. These obligations could be crushing, especially in lean years when there was barely enough food to survive. Yet the demands of the Lord were not suspended, for feudal obligations were rigid and relentless. In addition, the church claimed its tithe, usually a tenth of produce. Thus, even in the best of years, peasants found themselves surrendering much of what they grew. The sense of struggling against the land was therefore not only agricultural but social, for peasants labored endlessly to produce grain that would fill other men's tables. The knowledge that their own bellies might remain empty while their lord's barns overflowed added bitterness to the already grinding hardship of their work. Farming was never a purely private endeavor. It was entangled with hierarchy, custom, and authority, all of which ensured that peasants remained bound to both the soil and the society above them. Beyond grain, peasants grew other crops, though usually in smaller amounts. Vegetables like beans, peas, onions, and cabbages were staples, planted in household gardens or the less fertile corners of communal fields. These foods provided vital nutrition, but they were seen as secondary to grain, which dominated medieval diets. In some regions, root vegetables such as turnips and parsnips were common, while in others, leafy greens filled the pot. Fruits, when available, were gathered from hedgerows or small orchards, though these were more seasonal treats than reliable staples. Livestock too played a role in peasant survival, but few could afford to maintain large herds. Cows, sheep, and pigs were often shared resources, grazing on common land rather than belonging to a single family. Animal manure was essential for fertilizing fields, yet this was never enough to sustain the soil indefinitely. Farming was therefore a delicate balancing act between land, crops, animals, and weather, where any imbalance could lead to scarcity. Peasants did not farm for profit, but for subsistence, producing just enough to endure from one year to the next. The fields provided life, but always under the shadow of shortage, reminding peasants that abundance was rare and hunger always near. The unpredictability of weather made farming a gamble each year. A late frost could destroy seedlings, while storms might flatten ripening grain. Summer droughts left fields parched, while autumn floods drowned the harvest before it could be gathered. Peasants lived at the mercy of forces far beyond their control, and their prayers often focused on the heavens for good weather. Famine was a constant fear, and history records frequent periods of hunger, when failed harvests forced people to eat acorns, bark, or the seed grain meant for planting. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making peasants more vulnerable to disease. The Black Death in the 14th century spread all the more easily because so many were already weakened by poor diets. To struggle with the land was to struggle with fate itself, and many peasants accepted that hardship was part of the natural order of life. Yet in quiet ways, they also fought against it, saving seed, rotating crops, tending gardens, and sharing labor with neighbors to improve their chances of survival. The land was their adversary, but also their greatest ally, for without it, there was no life at all. Every furrow dug into the soil was a prayer for survival, whispered with sweat and toil. Community was essential in managing the challenges of farming. No peasant could survive alone, for the demands of the land were too great. Villagers shared tools, livestock, and labor, pooling their efforts during plowing, sowing, and harvesting. This cooperation was not born of kindness alone, but of necessity. To fall behind in one's work risked disaster, and neighbors often stepped in to ensure no field remained unplowed or unharvested. The common lands of the village, used for grazing animals or gathering firewood, reinforced this sense of shared survival. Yet cooperation was always balanced with rivalry, as families compared harvests and resented unequal holdings. The land bound them together, but it also set them apart, for wealthier peasants might accumulate more strips or animals, gradually rising above their neighbors. Despite such inequalities, the rhythms of farming enforced unity. When it was time to sow or reap, the entire village felt the urgency. Farming was thus not only an economic activity, but also a social one, tying peasants to each other as firmly as it tied them to the soil. Through their labor in the fields, they wove the fabric of medieval village life, stitching survival from shared hardship and communal struggle. In the end, the struggle with the land defined the very identity of medieval peasants. Their days were measured not by the hours of the clock, but by the demands of the soil and the cycle of the seasons. From the first thaw of spring to the final harvest of autumn, their lives followed the relentless pace of agriculture. The land offered no luxury, no forgiveness, only the hope of survival if properly respected and endlessly worked. For the peasant, there was no escape from the fields, for they were both prison and lifeline. To live was to till, to sow, to reap, and to hope. It was a life of constant effort, yet one that tied peasants deeply to the rhythms of nature. While lords and kings fought wars and built castles, it was the peasants' struggle with the land that sustained all of medieval society. Without their unending toil, there would have been no bread on the table, no armies in the field, no monasteries filled with prayer. The fields were thus both a battleground and a sanctuary, the place where life was forged through sweat, hardship, and resilience. In every furrow, the story of medieval survival was written. When the long hours in the fields ended, the medieval peasant returned to a dwelling that was far removed from what we might imagine as a home. Most peasant houses were small, often one-room structures made from wattle and daub, woven wooden strips coated with clay and mud. The roof was thatched with straw, offering some shelter from rain, but not always from leaks. Inside, there was little furniture, perhaps a rough wooden table, a few stools, and straw-stuffed bedding shared by the entire family. The walls were darkened with smoke from the central hearth, for most homes had no chimney, only a hole in the roof through which smoke might escape. This hearth was the heart of the household, providing warmth, light, and a place to cook, though it also filled the room with soot and ash. Life in these homes was cramped, smoky, and noisy, yet it was where family bonds were formed and survival strategies were shared. The home was not just a shelter from the elements, but also a gathering place where stories, songs, and prayers softened the weight of daily labor. The hearth, simple as it was, carried enormous significance in peasant life. It was where meals were cooked, often simple porridge, bread, or stew simmering slowly over the flames. It was where warmth was gathered on long winter nights, the family huddled together against the cold. It was also a place of symbolism, representing continuity, protection, and the presence of the divine. Many households kept charms or crosses above the fire, invoking blessings to safeguard the home. Children played in its glow, learning the rhythms of family life, while elders sat nearby, telling tales of ancestors and past hardships. Though humble, the hearth served as a reminder that even in the harshest of conditions, there could be comfort, togetherness, and a flicker of security. The smoke that filled the house may have stung their eyes, but the fire itself was a living presence, one that bound the household together. For medieval peasants, to tend the fire was to tend the very heart of family existence, ensuring warmth, food, and survival through the turning of the seasons. Daily family life was shaped by strict routines, divided among men, women, and children according to necessity rather than choice. Men often carried the responsibility of the heavier work, plowing, repairing tools, managing animals, while women oversaw much of the household economy. Women brewed ale, baked bread, spun wool, and cared for both children and livestock. They were also active in the fields during sowing and harvest, for every pair of hands was needed when survival was at stake. Children contributed from a young age, tending geese, gathering firewood, or carrying water. There was little concept of childhood as we think of it today. Instead, children were seen as small adults, expected to learn their roles early and to grow into the same routines that had shaped their parents. This division of labor created a rhythm within the household, a pattern of shared burdens that reinforced the interconnectedness of family members. Every task, no matter how small, contributed to the fragile balance of survival, and within this system, family bonds were less about sentiment than about necessity. The material possessions inside a peasant's home were few and modest. A family might own a chest for storage, a few clay or wooden bowls, and perhaps a small iron pot for cooking. Bedding often consisted of straw or rushes laid on the ground, sometimes with woolen blankets if the family was fortunate. Clothing was functional and often patched many times over, for fabric was expensive and every scrap had to be used carefully. A family's wealth might be measured not in coins, but in tools, livestock, and the ability to sustain themselves from year to year. Despite this scarcity, homes were not devoid of comfort. The walls might be decorated with religious symbols, flowers hung to dry, or herbs tucked into corners to ward off pests. These small touches reflected the human desire to make even the simplest dwelling feel lived in, to create beauty and meaning amidst poverty. The peasant house may have been modest, even bleak by modern standards, but within its smoky walls, it held the warmth of family life, laughter shared at the table, and the determination to endure together. Meals, though plain, were central to the rhythm of peasant family life. Bread was the staple, often coarse and dark, made from rye or barley rather than wheat, which was reserved for the wealthier classes. Alongside bread, peasants ate pottage, a thick stew of vegetables, grains, and occasionally a scrap of meat or bone for flavor. Dairy products such as cheese and butter added variety, while eggs and garden vegetables supplemented the diet when available. Meals were eaten together, usually around the central hearth, and though food was simple, the act of sharing it reinforced the bonds of the household. Children learned early to value every bite, for food was never taken for granted. During lean years, meals might shrink to little more than bread and thin broth. Yet even then, the family gathered together in the ritual of eating, a practice that bound them to one another and gave shape to their days. The hearth meal was not just nourishment, but also a reminder of togetherness, a daily reaffirmation that survival was a collective effort. Family bonds in the medieval peasant household were practical but deeply significant. Marriage was less about romance and more about alliance, survival, and the continuation of family labor. Husbands and wives shared the struggles of the land, dividing work to sustain their household. Children were both a blessing and a burden, another mouth to feed, but also an extra set of hands to work. Elders, when they survived into old age, were valued as sources of knowledge, even if their ability to contribute physically diminished. Life expectancy was short, and death was a frequent visitor, whether through illness, famine, or accident. This fragility of life made the family unit all the more important, a network of support in a world where larger social safety nets scarcely existed. Within the smoke-stained walls of their home, peasants found identity and resilience, clinging to one another as they navigated the uncertainties of survival. Evenings in a peasant household offered moments of rest and reflection after the day's labor. With no artificial light, darkness fell quickly, and families often gathered around the fire to talk, mend clothing, or prepare for the following day. Songs might be sung, stories told, and prayers recited before bed. These simple rituals gave a sense of continuity and comfort, a reminder that even in poverty, the rhythm of human life carried traditions and culture. Sleep came early, with family members lying close together for warmth. Privacy was almost non-existent, but this closeness fostered intimacy and unity. The night was not entirely restful, however, for the sounds of animals, the chill of the wind, or the fear of spirits and thieves often disturbed sleep. Yet within these smoky, crowded homes, there was also a sense of safety, the reassurance of being together under one roof, bound by kinship and necessity. The home was also a place where religion intertwined with daily life. Crosses hung on walls, prayers were said before meals, and holy days dictated the rhythm of labor and rest. The church's influence extended into every corner of family existence, reminding peasants that their struggles were part of a greater cosmic order. Births, marriages, and deaths were marked with blessings, weaving family life into the fabric of Christian ritual. Even the hearth fire might be associated with sacred symbolism, its flame linked to divine presence and protection. For peasants, faith was not abstract but lived daily, in prayers whispered over children, in hopes for a good harvest, and in the acceptance of suffering as part of life's burden. The home, then, was not merely a physical shelter but also a spiritual one, where earthly survival and divine belief came together. Though poor, smoky, and fragile, the peasant home was the center of medieval family life. It was where work and rest, struggle and joy, faith and survival all converged. Within its walls, generations shared the burdens of the land and the uncertainties of existence. The hearth bound them together, the routines of daily life sustained them, and the bonds of kinship gave them strength to face each season anew. In these modest homes, far from the castles of lords and the grandeur of churches, the real heartbeat of medieval society pulsed steadily. For it was here, in the smoky glow of the hearth, that peasants found the courage to endure, to hope, and to live. The home was never perfect, never easy, but it was the foundation upon which all else rested. It was the true sanctuary of the medieval peasant, humble yet vital, shaping every day and every night in their world. To truly understand the daily lives of medieval peasants, one must step into the world of faith and belief that shaped nearly every thought and action. Religion was not simply something practiced on Sundays. It was the framework of existence, the lens through which peasants understood sickness, famine, harvest, and fortune. The church calendar dictated the rhythm of life, fasting seasons, feast days, saintly celebrations, and holy obligations. A peasant's very identity was intertwined with the church, from baptism in infancy to the final rites at death. The village church was not just a place of worship, but the center of communal life, standing as the tallest and most enduring structure in many small settlements. For the peasant, life was uncertain, fragile, and often cruel, but religion offered a promise of order, meaning, and eventual salvation. Even when the fields failed or lords demanded more labor, the teachings of the church reminded peasants that their suffering mirrored Christ's, and that obedience might secure eternal reward. Everyday rituals of religion were not only about prayer, but also about the physical, sensory experience of faith. The sound of church bells marked the passing of time, calling villagers to Mass, reminding them of prayer hours, or announcing death in the parish. Inside, the flicker of candlelight illuminated holy images, icons, and statues of saints. The smell of incense filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of wax and stone. For peasants, who often lived in smoky, cramped huts, the church was a space that felt both otherworldly and comforting. The Latin liturgy was mysterious, as few peasants could read or understand the words, but the rituals themselves carried deep power. A procession on a feast day, a blessing over the fields before planting, or a holy relic displayed by a traveling priest could stir awe and reaffirm the sense that God's presence was woven into the very fabric of life. Faith was not something distant. It was lived and experienced daily in 1,000 small ways. Peasants held a deep attachment to saints, who were seen as intercessors between humanity and God. Every village had its patron saint, often linked to the local church, and peasants turned to these holy figures in times of need. Saint Isidore, for example, was revered by farmers, and prayers to him were offered for fertile soil and good harvests. When illness struck, peasants might pray to Saint Roch, protector against plagues, or Saint Apollonia for relief from toothache. Life was filled with dangers, disease, childbirth, accidents, hunger, and saints became spiritual guardians who could intercede where human medicine or effort fell short. Their feast days were not only religious but social occasions, bringing processions, celebrations, and communal meals. In these moments, the entire village would pause from labor, joining in a collective expression of devotion and hope. Saints, miracles, and relics made the divine tangible, connecting peasants to a greater spiritual order that promised justice, even if the earthly world seemed unfair. Rituals tied religion directly to the cycles of nature and the land itself. Blessings of seeds before planting, prayers for rain during drought, or processions through fields with holy crosses were all common. The agricultural year was inseparable from the religious year. Spring sowing might coincide with Easter, while autumn harvests aligned with Michaelmas. To peasants, there was no division between the sacred and the practical. Working the land was as much a spiritual act as it was physical labor. Droughts or floods were not simply natural misfortunes, but punishments or tests from God. A poor harvest was not explained by chance, but by sin, lack of devotion, or the anger of saints. This mindset gave peasants a sense of participation in divine order, but it also carried heavy burdens of guilt and fear. A failed crop could lead not only to hunger, but also to soul-searching, penance, and communal rituals meant to restore harmony with God. Medieval peasants also lived with a vivid fear of sin and the afterlife. Hell was described with terrifying detail from the pulpit, filled with fire, demons, and endless torment for those who disobeyed God's law. Heaven, by contrast, was depicted as a realm of peace and abundance, free of pain and suffering. This stark contrast made the choices of daily life feel weighty, even for those with little power. Confession, prayer, fasting, and obedience were seen as crucial steps toward salvation. Priests reminded peasants of their duties not only to God, but also to the social hierarchy, teaching that obedience to lords was part of divine order. For many, faith was both a comfort and a chain. It gave meaning to suffering, but also justified the unequal world they lived in. To disobey, complain, or rebel was not only risky in earthly terms, but also dangerous for one's soul. Thus, religion helped maintain both hope and submission in peasant society. The rituals of death revealed perhaps the most powerful aspects of the medieval mindset. A peasant's final moments were filled with prayer, confession, and the anointing of oils by a priest. Family and neighbors gathered around the dying, ensuring that no soul passed without the rites that might speed their way to heaven. Death was not the end but a transition, and the community mourned with processions, tolling bells, and masses for the departed. Graveyards, often next to the village church, were sacred spaces where ancestors rested, reminding the living daily of mortality and faith. Ghost stories, tales of restless souls, and warnings of purgatory reinforced the idea that one's spiritual state after death depended on a lifetime of devotion. In this way, religion was a constant companion from the cradle to the grave. For the medieval peasant, faith was not abstract. It was life itself, woven into every ritual, every hope, and every fear. For most medieval peasants, life was defined by unending cycles of toil, long days bent over fields, back-breaking labor, and the constant worry of feeding families from year to year. Yet, within this hard existence, there were treasured pauses, moments when the weight of survival was lifted and replaced with laughter, music, and togetherness. These came in the form of feasts, fairs, and festivals. They were not just simple breaks from work. They were essential to the medieval spirit, reminding peasants that joy and celebration were as much a part of life as suffering and toil. Feast days often revolved around the church calendar: Christmas, Easter, and saints' feast days, each carrying both sacred and communal significance. Villagers looked forward to these occasions for weeks in advance, preparing food, decorating, and sometimes even setting aside bits of grain or meat to ensure there was something special to share. Festivals were more than merriment. They were the binding thread of community life, moments when every man, woman, and child could step outside of their daily burdens and join in a collective sense of belonging and joy. Food was at the heart of every feast. In times when peasants subsisted largely on dark bread, porridge, and occasional vegetables, a festival meal was nothing short of extraordinary. Meat, often rare in the peasant diet, would appear on tables, perhaps a pig roasted over a fire, or a stew enriched with game hunted in nearby woods. Ale flowed more freely, and honey cakes, pies, or spiced bread might appear as luxuries seldom tasted in ordinary days. These gatherings allowed peasants to eat their fill, to loosen the ever-tight belt of hunger, if only for a brief time. The act of sharing food also carried symbolic weight. It reinforced bonds among neighbors, reminded the poor that generosity still had a place in the community, and mirrored the biblical image of the heavenly banquet. The sheer sensory delight of a feast, the smell of roasting meat, the sight of tables laden with food, the taste of something sweet or rare, made these days glow brightly in the memory of peasants long after they ended, sustaining them through leaner times. Fairs were another highlight of the medieval year, particularly for peasants who otherwise rarely traveled far from their villages. These bustling gatherings combined commerce with festivity, turning market squares or open fields into vibrant centers of activity. Merchants from distant towns would arrive with exotic goods, salt, spices, brightly dyed fabrics, trinkets, or tools that could not be crafted locally. For peasants, walking through a fair was both overwhelming and wondrous, a chance to glimpse a wider world beyond the narrow borders of their fields. They might buy small luxuries, barter their produce, or simply watch entertainers perform. Jugglers, musicians, acrobats, and storytellers who brought color and magic to otherwise simple lives. Fairs were also places of gossip and news, where stories of kings, wars, and distant lands filtered into peasant ears. Though money was scarce, the fair offered something beyond trade. It offered escape, wonder, and the intoxicating feeling of being part of something larger than the village. Music and dance lay at the heart of festivals and gave peasants a language of joy that required no words. Simple instruments, flutes, fiddles, drums, and bagpipes would strike up lively tunes, calling young and old alike into circles of dance. Children squealed with delight, men and women joined hands, and the rhythmic pounding of feet turned packed earth into a stage. Song, often passed down orally, told tales of love, loss, or laughter, weaving together the shared experiences of a community. For a few hours, laborers who normally bent their backs under the sun could stand tall, move freely, and celebrate their vitality. Music was more than entertainment. It was a release, a reminder of humanity's resilience, and a way of binding hearts together. To dance in the firelight, under the open sky, after days of toil in the dirt, was to reclaim a piece of joy that work so often buried. These sounds, carried across fields and villages, lingered long after the instruments had fallen silent, remembered as one of life's rarest treasures. Festivals also carried deep religious meaning, blending the sacred with the secular in ways that felt natural to medieval peasants. Christmas was not just about the nativity story, but about warmth in the coldest months, shared meals, and the lighting of candles against the long winter nights. Easter symbolized renewal, marked by springtime blossoms and the return of green to the fields. Saints' days often came with processions through villages, where banners were carried, relics displayed, and prayers recited over fields for good harvests. These moments reinforced the belief that joy was not sinful, but a reflection of God's grace. In fact, the church calendar itself ensured that peasants had more days of rest and celebration than modern workers, though, of course, these days often involved mandatory rituals alongside merriment. For peasants, there was no clear divide between devotion and delight. Both flowed together, reminding them that even in a world of hardship, divine rhythm had written joy into the year. Carnivals and seasonal festivals gave peasants a rare taste of freedom and inversion of order. During these times, social hierarchies softened, and the usual restraints of behavior loosened. Masks were worn, jokes were made at the expense of lords or priests, and ordinary rules seemed to bend under the weight of laughter. Some festivals allowed role reversals, where peasants could mimic nobles or mock authority figures, a temporary but cathartic release from the rigid structures of daily life. Bonfires blazed, ale flowed without measure, and the village square rang with jokes, pranks, and revelry. These carnivals were not acts of rebellion, but of renewal, valves that released tension, reminding both peasants and rulers that joy was as necessary to survival as obedience. The laughter of those nights echoed against the dark backdrop of medieval struggle, proving that even the poorest laborer could, for a time, feel rich in spirit. Seasonal fairs and festivals also offered opportunities for romance, courtship, and the strengthening of family bonds. Young men and women, who might otherwise see each other only in the context of labor or church, could mingle more freely under the relaxed air of celebration. Dances, songs, and games provided spaces where affections could blossom, and marriages were sometimes arranged or initiated during these festive gatherings. For parents, festivals were also times to teach children traditions, songs, and stories, passing down the cultural memory of the community. Grandparents might sit by the fire, telling tales of past festivals, while young ones learned the rhythms of music and the joy of communal feasting. These shared moments created a tapestry of belonging, ensuring that even in the face of poverty or hardship, the identity of the community endured. To peasants, festivals were more than fleeting pleasures. They were living memory, woven into the very essence of family and village life. The memory of feasts, fairs, and festivals lingered long after the music had stopped and the tables had been cleared. For peasants, who lived lives often overshadowed by labor and fear, these moments were essential beacons of light. They gave strength to endure the next day's toil, laughter to counterbalance grief, and a sense of shared humanity that work alone could not provide. In these rare escapes, peasants discovered not only pleasure but also dignity, a reminder that their lives were not only about bending to hardship, but also about celebrating existence. When the bells called them back to work and the fields once again swallowed their days, they carried with them the echo of laughter, the taste of rare food, the sight of dancing flames, and the touch of neighbors' hands in dance. In this way, festivals were not only brief interludes, but lifelines, giving peasants the resilience to face the endless cycles of medieval toil. The medieval peasant lived in a world not only shaped by the rhythm of the seasons and the toil of the soil, but also by the ever-present weight of authority. For most peasants, authority came in two forms: the lord of the manor, who held power over their daily lives, and the distant but feared systems of royal and church law. To survive in this world was to navigate the complex web of obligations, duties, and punishments that defined medieval justice. A peasant could live his entire life without ever seeing a king, but the influence of his lord and the justice system could be felt in every corner of the village, from the way land was inherited to the penalties for small crimes like stealing a loaf of bread. Authority was everywhere, a constant reminder that survival was not only about feeding oneself, but also about obeying and submitting to those above. The lord of the manor was the central figure of authority in most peasants' lives. He was the owner of the land, and the peasants who lived there were bound to it by feudal obligations. These obligations could take many forms: labor on the lord's domain fields, payments in grain or livestock, or services such as repairing roads and maintaining buildings. In return, the lord was expected to provide protection, both from outside threats like raiders or rival lords, and from disputes within the community. Yet this protection came at a cost, for the lord was also the chief judge in the manor court. Disputes over grazing rights, accusations of theft, or even questions about who owed what duty to whom were all decided here. The manor court was a world where the lord's authority was absolute, and a peasant's fate could be altered with a single word. The manor court was not always a place of cruelty. It often served as a practical mechanism for keeping order in the village. It was where quarrels between neighbors could be resolved, or where boundaries between fields were formally recognized. But for those who stood accused of wrongdoing, it could be a frightening place. The punishments imposed could vary widely depending on the crime. Small fines were common for minor offenses, but harsher punishments awaited those guilty of serious transgressions. A peasant caught poaching deer in the lord's forest might face mutilation or even death, for game laws were strict, protecting the lord's hunting rights above all else. Such punishments reinforced the idea that the land, and even the animals upon it, belonged to the lord, not the peasants who worked and lived on it. Beyond the manor courts, there existed broader systems of justice that stretched to the crown and the church. Royal law might seem far away to the average peasant, but it could intrude dramatically when serious crimes like murder or treason were involved. Royal sheriffs or judges would ride through the shires, holding sessions known as assizes, where they dispensed the king's justice. These visits were rare but intimidating, reminding peasants that even in remote villages, the king's authority could reach them. The presence of royal officials often meant harsher, more formalized punishments. Executions, mutilations, and the public display of criminals were meant not only to punish the guilty, but also to serve as warnings to the living. Justice in medieval times was rarely about rehabilitation. It was about order, fear, and the demonstration of power. The church also played a powerful role in shaping medieval ideas of justice. Sin and crime were often inseparable, and an offense against a neighbor could also be considered an offense against God. Church courts were concerned with matters such as marriage, morality, and oaths, and while they were generally less brutal than secular courts, their power lay in spiritual punishments. A peasant excommunicated from the church would find himself cut off not only from religious rituals, but also from the social fabric of his community. To be excluded from the sacraments meant eternal damnation, a fear that could weigh more heavily than any physical punishment. In this way, The church wielded immense authority, often overlapping with the secular power of lords and kings. Punishments themselves reveal much about the harshness of medieval justice. Stocks and pillories were common in villages, where wrongdoers might be locked in public view for hours or even days. Such punishments were humiliating, allowing neighbors to mock, spit upon, or throw refuse at the accused. For more serious crimes, branding, whipping, or mutilation, such as the cutting off of ears or hands, were intended to leave permanent reminders of guilt. Execution, usually by hanging, was the ultimate penalty, and it was often carried out in public to deter others. These spectacles were grim but deeply woven into the culture of authority. To the medieval peasant, witnessing such punishments was a reminder of their place in the hierarchy and the dangers of disobedience. Yet justice in medieval times was not always one-sided oppression. Villagers could appeal to their lords, or even to the king, if they believed themselves wronged. There are records of peasants banding together to petition for fairer treatment, or of local customs being used to temper the harshness of feudal law. While rare, these instances show that peasants were not entirely without voice, though their power was limited. More often, survival depended on compliance, on paying fines, offering labor, and avoiding conflict with those who held authority. The constant balancing act between submission and resistance shaped much of peasant life, a delicate dance within the rigid framework of medieval justice. The medieval concept of justice was deeply tied to hierarchy and order. Everyone had a place, from king to peasant, and to step outside that place invited punishment. For peasants, this meant living with the awareness that authority was always near, whether in the form of the local lord, the distant king, or the ever-watchful church. It was a world where power was visible not only in castles and cathedrals, but also in the small wooden stocks in the village square. The harsh hand of authority was never far away, pressing down on daily life, guiding behavior, and shaping the very way peasants thought about right and wrong. For the peasant lying in bed at the end of a long day, the awareness of justice and authority was as constant as the call of the church bell or the demands of the fields. It was another weight upon tired shoulders, another force shaping a life already bound by hard labor and uncertainty. Justice was not something they sought, but something they endured, a reminder that survival in the medieval world was not only about enduring hunger, toil, and disease, but also about navigating the complex and often merciless structures of power. When the sun dipped below the horizon in a medieval village, the day's rhythm shifted into something slower, quieter, and yet strangely more uncertain. Nightfall was not just the closing of a day. It was the entrance into a world that felt different, almost mystical, for those who lived without the glow of electricity or the safety of modern locks. For peasants, who worked from the first light until dusk, the setting sun marked both relief and apprehension. The village grew darker, the fields silent, and the forests nearby seemed to breathe with unseen life. The quiet was never complete. Dogs barked, owls hooted, The wind groaned against wooden huts, but the darkness pressed in from all sides. To live in a medieval village meant to accept the night as a realm of shadows, mystery, and danger. The day belonged to work and order, but the night belonged to forces beyond human control. Inside their simple timber or wattle-and daub cottages, peasants gathered around the hearth as night deepened. Firelight flickered, casting orange glows against rough walls, offering the only dependable source of warmth and illumination. The hearth was not just for cooking, it was the heart of the household, the one place where the family felt secure. Yet firelight was weak. Beyond its reach, corners dissolved into blackness, and stepping outside into the village lanes meant facing a near-total absence of light. Torches, oil lamps, or tallow candles were rare luxuries for the poor. Most peasants saved such precious lighting for emergencies. Instead, they relied on the moon and stars when venturing outdoors, and if clouds smothered the sky, the night became an impenetrable void. In that darkness, every sound seemed louder, every shadow more threatening, feeding both imagination and fear. For many, nighttime was a time of rest, but rest itself was different than what we think of today. Without strict artificial schedules, peasants often practiced what historians call segmented sleep. After working from dawn to dusk, villagers would retire early, drifting off to a first sleep shortly after nightfall. This might last for a few hours, after which many would wake in the middle of the night. In those in-between hours, known as the watch, they prayed, whispered with family, tended the fire, or sometimes visited neighbors in the dark stillness. Then, they would return to bed for a second sleep, continuing until dawn approached. Sleep was not one solid block, but a cycle that mirrored the rhythms of the natural world, deeply connected to the rising and setting of the sun. Beds, however, were hardly comfortable by modern standards. Peasants slept on straw pallets stuffed with rushes or hay, perhaps covered with woolen blankets if they were fortunate. Families often shared these sleeping arrangements. Husband, wife, children, and sometimes even animals huddled together for warmth in the chill of night. Privacy was rare. In poorer households, space was so limited that the same single-room structure served as kitchen, dining room, and bedroom. For them, sleep was less about relaxation and more about recovering enough strength to rise again with the dawn. The smell of damp straw, smoke from the hearth, and even livestock nearby often filled the air, yet these humble resting places were home, a shield against the uncertainty waiting outside the door. Superstitions made nighttime an especially potent realm in the medieval imagination. Darkness was associated with the supernatural. Witches, ghosts, demons, and wandering spirits were all believed to be more active at night. Tales of fairies luring people away, of werewolves stalking the edges of villages, or of demons creeping into homes weighed on the peasant mind. Church bells might ring to keep away spirits, and prayers were whispered before bed to invoke divine protection through the vulnerable hours of sleep. To wake in the dead of night and hear a strange knock or an animal shriek could fill a person with dread. In a world where wolves still roamed forests, where bandits could strike, and where disease carried by vermin lurked in the dark, fear of the night was not entirely irrational. Night was a frontier where the known world gave way to the unknown. Safety at night depended greatly on the village community. Many settlements had curfews imposed by local lords or the church, marking when fires had to be banked and when people should remain indoors. Guards or watchmen might patrol the streets in larger towns, but in smaller villages, households relied on one another for warnings and protection. A barking dog could alert an entire cluster of cottages. Families bolted their doors with crude wooden bars, and windows, if they existed, were often shuttered tightly. The aim was to keep the outside world at bay, whether wolves, thieves, or spirits. To survive the night was to endure vulnerability, trusting both one's faith and one's community to guard against the unknown. Still, night was not entirely grim. For some, it was a time of rare togetherness. Families, no longer scattered across fields and tasks, shared stories by the fire. Grandparents recounted tales of saints, heroes, or tricksters, weaving oral traditions that preserved community identity. Children listened, their imaginations filling with both wonder and unease. Songs might be sung softly, not to disturb neighbors through thin walls. In these moments, the night became intimate, connecting people not just through fear, but through warmth, tradition, and the comfort of companionship. It was a nightly rhythm where survival met culture, where toil gave way to memory and storytelling. Occasionally, villagers ventured into the night for communal purposes. Festivals, religious vigils, or emergencies drew people from their beds into moonlit gatherings. Bonfires, in particular, transformed the fearful dark into a space of light and celebration, warding off not just the cold, but also the terrors of shadow. The night of a feast could feel entirely different from the night of ordinary labor, a reminder that, while the dark was dangerous, it could also be reclaimed for joy, ritual, and human connection. But such nights were rare. For most, the dark was a boundary best respected. As dawn approached, the edge of fear lifted. The rooster crowed, shadows softened, and the eastern sky blushed with light. Fires were rekindled, animals stirred, and the village slowly awoke. Night had passed, with its silences, its mysteries, and its threats, and a new day of labor awaited. For medieval peasants, this cycle was unending. Day for work, night for uncertainty and rest. To live in such a rhythm was to live close to nature, bound by the sun and moon, shaped by the elements, and humbled by the darkness that could never fully be mastered. Nightfall in a medieval village was both a refuge and a reminder that life, fragile and fleeting, was lived in the thin space between light and dark. And so, dear listener, our quiet walk through the life of the medieval peasant comes to an end. We have risen with them at dawn, labored under the weight of the fields, warmed ourselves by the hearth, shared in their prayers and rituals, and watched as night once again swallowed the village in silence. Their days were hard, often uncertain, yet filled with a rhythm of life that bound them together: family, faith, and the steady passing of seasons. As you rest now, imagine the gentle crackle of the fire fading into embers, the last whispers of a village settling down for the night, and the calm stillness that only darkness brings. Just as they laid their heads down after toil, so too may you find peace and comfort, letting the weight of the day slip softly away. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the forgotten paths of history. May these stories carry you into restful dreams and remind you that even in the simplest of lives, there is a beauty worth remembering. Sleep well, dear listener, and until we meet again on another night of history told in whispers, may you drift gently into the past and into dreams.